All right, well, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Kevin Whelan, who's the inaugural director of the Chaoimh Centre of the University of Notre Dame in Ireland, and also a great friend to the Abbey Theatre. He's authored or edited 20 books and more, and has lectured on Irish topics all over the world. Among his books are The Tree of Liberty, and my particular favourite, Atlas of the Irish Rural Landscape. And if you don't know this book, have a look at it. It's an exquisite looking book, but it's also an amazing resource. So will you please welcome Professor Kevin Whelan, who's going to chair this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Aileen. Okay, good morning, everybody. I want to talk about one of the key words in the title of this conference, which is memory, and really about the relationship between memory and history, and then to also finish really with some observations on where that leaves theatre. And then I have the luxury of pontificating as somebody who never stands on a stage, never has to deliver a theatre product, never has to engage audience, and never has to go through the collaborative art that theatre is. But we're very lucky this morning to be joined by three very distinguished theatre practitioners. So Grace, Eleanor, and Bairbre will really enhance the stage because they are, as I say, theatre people. But I do want to begin with a comment from the Irish-American playwright Eugene O'Neill, talking about the characters in Long Day's Journey into Night. And this is what he said himself about the characters. At the final curtain, there they still are, trapped within each other by the past, each guilty and at the same time innocent, scorning, loving, pitying each other, understanding and yet not understanding at all, forgiven, but still doomed never to be able to forget. And I wonder how many Irish plays would that describe. But the idea of memory and the idea of, as it were, the toxicity of memory is something which you could say is central to the European Union project, which really emerged out of how to handle the legacy of 2 world wars. You could say that the whole history of the world, in a way, is a legacy of violence and the trauma and the wounds that leaves. And the French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, who has grappled most extensively, I think, with the issue of memory and was interested in the relationship between memory, but seen memory not as essentially being about the past at all, but as being about the present and, more importantly, about the future. And in a sense, what Ricoeur has focused on is the ethics of memory. What is an appropriate memory, and how should we approach perpetuating it? Now, Ricoeur begins by defining different levels of memory. And the first one, the one that we're all familiar with, is the individual or the personal level, most associated with the psychoanalytic tradition. And that begins with Freud, who asked, looking at it clinically, what constitutes an acceptable past to an individual? If things have happened in the past which have been disturbing or traumatic, how does the individual handle them? And his conclusion at first seems paradoxical, that a lack of memory is a problem, but equally that an excess of memory is also a problem, because too much memory can flood, overwhelm, and paralyze the individual. But too little memory, you can feel weightless, unanchored, unbalanced. Too little memory can emanate from repression and not being able to cope with something that is extremely damaging. Abuse, violence, trauma lodge in the psyche as an open wound that never fully closes over or heals. And we're very familiar with that psychoanalytic or therapeutic model of memory and about the efforts then to create a healthy balance between what psychoanalysts call mourning and melancholia. Mourning, the natural human response to the loss of a loved object, seeks to reconcile the self with that lost object of love. By contrast, melancholia is incomplete mourning, the inability to move beyond the loss that is internalized as a despairing and never met longing for reunification. When you're in the melancholic state, you cannot move beyond the loss of the trauma and are condemned to forms of repetition, like O'Neill's trapped characters at the end of his play. In psychoanalytic terms, melancholic people live in a disconnected relationship with the day-to-day realities of life. And psychoanalysts suggest that the damaged patient needs to move from melancholia to mourning, involving a working through from repetition through remembering and eventually to reconciliation. Now, that's a standard version of mourning and melancholia, and in a sense also a statement of the problem of memory, if I might phrase it that way, the problem of memory and trauma. It has often been described as the talking cure. If people can only talk about what is blocked within them, tell their story, they can release the blockage and help people to move on. And you see, what is interesting in that is that stories, narratives, the ability to speak, lies at the heart of individual identity. And it's the stories that we tell about ourselves, about others, about our relationships as we now are, and what we were in the past, and how we came to be where we are now, even perhaps as we leave it behind. It's those stories that are crucial to our sense of identity. So there's a relationship between memory and identity in that sense. Because the other crucial feature of memory and identity is the continuity of identity across time. Because identity crucially involves the issue of sameness and difference. Part of how we define ourselves is through what we are not. We constantly define ourselves as much by what we are not as by what we are. You could say that modern Ireland is post-everything. Post-religion, post-national, post-colonial. And, in some respects, modern Ireland defines itself very much by not what it is, but what it's not. And we constantly define ourselves in that kind of way. To use the jargon, in terms of the other, that which lies outside our experience or outside our possibilities. But that problem of definition obviously accentuates or intensifies in situations of conflict, or where violence disfigures a society, or where we have a troubled and unsettled past. And our relationship then with the other can become overdetermined. Violence then becomes the originating moment in the mobilization of a collective identity, where cultural memory becomes a storage system of violence, wounds, scabs, angers, where the past bleeds uncontrollably into the present. We might then ask, is there ever a situation where we might have an ethical duty to forget and to forgive, as well as to remember? And Ricard reminds us that there is a close link between the word amnesty and the word amnesia. So is there ever a duty to go beyond anger and hatred towards achieving a new horizon of justice? And the key point I would want to make this morning is that in that sense, whereas history is about the past, memory is always about the present. Memory is never just retroactive. It is also crucially oriented towards the future and how we should balance the space of experience and the space of expectation. What is it that we need from the future, and how does how we handle the past get us to that future? And Ricard identifies that as an ethical memory, one that is not so much locked into the past, but that is concerned with opening the past as a mechanism to release the future, to help birth the future through understanding what has happened in the past. So in that sense, ethical memory seeks to move beyond melancholia, where we're constantly fixated and locked into the conflict on the moment of violence, on the originating traumatic event. So that would also be a way of stressing that memory is never static or unchanging. It's not a parcel that is passed intact from generation to generation and that remains unchanged in the process of transmission. Memory does not have to be an overwhelming thing, a coercive or intransigent force that traps us in a particular position. Memory is not a set of handcuffs that ties us to our history. Memory changes as we transmit it, as we tell the story, and dependent on to whom we tell that story. Now that might seem disturbing, especially for historians, because it seems to make the past and memory capricious, subjective, situational. But at another level, it gestures towards the possibility of educating or healing memory through the work of narrative, testimony, storytelling. And here we move towards theatre. Because I would want to stress here that really it is the work of the artist who can help us best in seeing things, in telling things, in imagining things another way. In the wider sense, the artist adjudicates between memory and history, between remembering and forgetting, because the stories we tell, the stories we choose not to tell, equally determine what it is we remember and what it is we forget. When it comes to memory, there is always a choice. We can decide how we want to tell our story, and that choice adjudicates, balance, or negotiates between the personal level and a wider collective identity. And that brings us to the role of the artist, the role of theatre, and the role of theatre makers. Because it's very important to stress the autonomy of art, that art has a necessary indifference to the conditions from which it arises, and the fact that it is never directly deducible from those circumstances. We should never and can never reduce the work of art to the conditions out of which it emerges. But neither can art occupy some pure, or uncontaminated, or autonomous realm immune from its historical and cultural context. So the work of art is always simultaneously disengaged and incriminated. Immersion in the archive of actuality will never produce a sufficient account of the otherness of art. Art, in that sense, can never just be, as it were, a critique of the past. It has always to be a repertoire of alternative possibilities. And the artist's ethical position then depends on trust in testimony, trust in the expressive power of language, trust in the moral power of the imagination, trust in the transformative potential of art, which, by refiguring how we think about the past, creates a different trajectory into the future. On the stage of the Abbey Theatre here, one could say that the new Ireland was imagined in the imaginative space, which then, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, which then allowed for the political space to emerge. In that sense, art always makes possible alternative futures. And art realizes its emancipatory function in the creation of those alternative futures. The very disengagement of art from, as it were, the ligatures, the ties of history, is therefore the analogue of human freedom, the instantiation of that which is not yet available. And that brings us to theatre, because theatre is obviously one of the preeminent ways in which we stage narratives, in which people get to tell their stories, but more importantly and crucially, in which an audience gets to hear those stories. And this morning we're joined by Grace Dyas, by Eleanor Methven, and by Bairbre, who, as I say, have the luxury, lack the luxury that I have of just being able to kind of pontificate about this, but who are actually theatre makers, very distinguished theatre makers involved in all kinds of work and interesting projects, and who have a very distinguished track record of work behind them in trying to engage, perhaps, with the issues that I talked about. So it's my very great pleasure now first to introduce Grace Dyas. I'm not going to recapitulate the greatest hits of Grace, or indeed of Eleanor and Bairbre, because it would usurp all our time. But let me say that Grace is a founder of Theatre Club, a tremendous theatre activist, a writer, but also fundamentally I think she thinks of herself as someone who changes things and makes new things happen. And she makes theatre because she wants to change the world, and that is a marvellous ambition. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce Grace Dyas.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I wasn't able to be here yesterday, so I suppose coming into the room today, it kind of feels like walking into the kitchen at a house party where a really serious conversation has happened and you just walked in. So hopefully I won't repeat what everyone said yesterday or something like that. I'm going to be talking about a show I made recently. I'm going to be talking about a show that I made recently with my company, Theatre Club. We were awarded a public art commission by Dublin City Council and the residents of St Michael's Estate to mark the regeneration of the estate, which is a 14-acre site in Inchicore, not 5 minutes away from here. That piece became history, the final part of our trilogy of plays about Ireland. Theatre Club worked in collaboration with the residents and the community of St Michael's Estate on the project for 2 years. I was the director, writer, producer of that project. Very early on, I realised that I could never get this right. The task was to mark, to commemorate, to bear witness, to represent St Michael's Estate. But why and to what end would have to be discovered. The first line spoken in the show is, in a lot of Irish plays there are monologues. The monologue is very popular in the Irish play. Plays are very important in Irish history. We have a strong cultural tradition of understanding our past through plays that reference, reenact and represent moments in our history. Rita Fagan, the director of the Family Resource Centre in St Michael's Estate, walked into our rehearsal room in November 2011. She and her colleagues in the community of St Michael's had been working with the Dublin City Council to commission a high-quality piece of contemporary art to mark the regeneration of St Michael's Estate. Theatre Club had just been awarded a residency to begin researching what our response would be to this place. She had been working in St Michael's Estate since 1985. A few months previously, she had organised a heritage walk of the local area, and Lauren Larkin and I attended. Lauren and I worked together in Theatre Club, and we were hungry for inspiration. We had no idea what we would make about this place. Up until then, the only thing I knew about St Michael's Estate was that it had been a fortress of drug abuse and deprivation in the late 90s when I was growing up 5 minutes down the road. On this heritage walk, I discovered that on this land there were symbols of our entire social history. There was much more to the story than that. Today, St Michael's Estate looks like a big empty field. It looks like a place where things used to be. If you went there today, behind me, you would see an old city graveyard. Daniel O'Connell had bought this land in 1824 so Catholics could say prayers at the graveside. I had never heard of Golden Bridge Cemetery. Our first Taoiseach, W.T. Cosgrave, is buried in there. It was his vision for the new state that he took charge of that it would provide social housing for its people. Up until recently, his grave lay in the shadow of the last 8-storey tower block of St Michael's Estate. It's hard not to see the pathos in that image, and that's just for starters. There are 3 buildings to my right. These are the last 3 remaining buildings of Richmond Barracks. This is where the 1916 revolutionaries were taken after they surrendered, but nobody knows that. That part is not in the history books. But we do know that they dreamed of a nation where all the children would be treated equally, because they wrote it down and we all read it, didn't we? There's more. Directly across from that is the site of Golden Bridge Industrial School. I had read about what happened there in the Ryan Report. I stood there and looked at the building and I thought about young girls making rosary beads and standing waiting on a landing all night waiting to be punished. But there was more to find here still. After independence, the barracks buildings were turned into Keogh Square and people lived here for 40 years. This was our first attempt at social housing. There was no heating there and no running water. This was called the debtor's prison. This is the place where you were sent when you couldn't pay your rent. By the late 1960s, the corporation were forced to knock the whole thing down and chalk it up to experience. St Michael's Estate, built from the leftover housing stock from Ballymun, was a new way to live in the city. People are going to live in the sky. These towers meant hope and prosperity. It meant that we were getting it right. In 1998, due to poor maintenance and bad housing policy, everyone who lived here voted to knock the whole thing down and start again. Unbelievably, 4 times in the last 15 years, the people of St Michael's Estate were promised regeneration, and 4 times they were let down. In 2008, Bernard McNamara pulled out of a public-private partnership to regenerate the area. It's hard to describe the shame that I feel as an Irish person when I think about the reality of what I've just said. That heritage walk was on a sunny day in July, and I watched Lauren and Rita walk ahead. I thought, what is the difference between Lauren and Rita? I had the idea that the estate could be Ireland, and Ireland could be the estate. It reminded me of the Yeats play Kathleen O'Houlihan that I had been reading and discussing here at the Abbey in the new playwrights programme. In the play, an old woman comes to the door of an Irish peasant family and asks for help protecting her 4 green fields which have been stolen from her. She is Ireland, and her fields are Ireland too. I began to see Lauren, these 14 acres, and Rita Fagan, and myself, all as Ireland too. And the show was born. History, a story about a place. Our intention was to tell the last 100 years of our country's social history through one 14-acre site, which simultaneously houses the attempts and failures of the Irish state to care for its people. Easy enough. But that wasn't really our idea. As you've heard, that was there when we found it. They say Michelangelo didn't carve David out of the marble, he found him in the stone. Rita Fagan was the first person to come and see any attempt we had made at staging the play History. She was concerned. Be very careful how you hand people back their history, she said to me. And those words stuck with me. If you've met Rita, you know why. I was in good company learning that lesson. Very often, Irish people don't like how they are represented on Irish stages. The go-to examples of that are the riots here after the Plough and the Playboy, part of the romantic history of this institution. And very often that moment is used as a comparison, a criticism of theatre today. It just doesn't make people riot like it used to. Today, if people don't like how they are represented in any play, or like the current production of The Risen People here, the most that we're going to get out of them is a tweet. I think riots have become something that we as theatre makers in the last few years have been told to look for. But why is rioting a good thing? Why is rioting the only way to mobilise people? I don't think that theatre has lost the power to mobilise people. The plays that were performed here, like Kathleen Houlihan, made people go out and fight in 1916. The theatre was an integral part of that. There was no division. I know that theatre has the potential to do that again. I know it does it to me. With history, I wanted to make something happen more than watching and witnessing. I wanted to give people access to action. I wanted to shine a light towards doing something about all of this. I'll try now to talk a little bit about how I went about doing that. But I should say history was made with over 20 people and an entire community, so whatever I say is just me speaking subjectively. That's my little disclaimer. Inspired by a strong tradition of creative protest in St. Michael's, I had the idea that the whole audience would leave the theatre together each night and go on a march to City Hall. The idea wasn't to do that because of romance or idealism, seriously. It was about a simple act of solidarity. It was a placeholder for the one small thing every single person can do. It was a space to meditate on our own agency as citizens. It was hard for people to believe that this would happen. I sounded like a crazy person. Everyone told me, no one will do that, no one will leave with you. Would you not just stick to the plays? Don't get in over your head. I think as an artist, my responsibility in how we deal with our past is to dream on a big scale. So I was determined. I soldiered on. I remember when my mother took me and my brother to Bairbre to see the place where Michael Collins was killed. We stayed there for over an hour and I was very moved. But I was also excited. The story of our nation is a tantalising romantic battle where good triumphs over evil. I could see the theatre in that, the film before the film was made. We are the little guys and we beat the bad guys. We are Rocky in Rocky 5. The worst things that could ever happen to us have happened, and we have survived with a glorious culture and a reputation around the world as the absolute crack. Most of the people I know now would feel very complicated things about that. In the last 10 years, there has been a glorious outpouring, a massive outpouring, a cry of sorts that says, that is all a lie. We have no glorious past, only shameful secrets and political corruption. Even as a child, I could see the fiction in all that romance there too. I wonder why we need that fiction. The reality is that we can't all agree on the past. I believe that we as a nation are suffering the effects of trauma. That really hurts. That is something very hard that we are all dealing with on a daily basis. And I knew that that would have to be part of Lauren Ireland's story too. Making history was the hardest thing I ever did. I was writing the unwritten history of our country to expose the massive human rights atrocities which had taken place here. Because what happened here, it didn't just happen here. What happened here happened all over the world, and it was happening over and over and over again. I felt a responsibility in talking about our contentious history to provide a way to empower people to be part of real change. That was my challenge. That still is my challenge. In the same place as the visionaries of the nation talked about a place that cherished all the children of the nation equally, the biggest human rights abuses in our country had taken place. A big part of our narrative, a big part of our story would have to be that the dream had never come true. Children performed in the show, children were at the heart of the process. Part of the style was to ask, how would you explain the complexity of that to a child? I spoke for hours to Christine Buckley. She grew up in Golden Bridge Industrial School, and she's one of the people who made the Ryan Report happen. She told me that when people come to her in the Ashling Centre, the place she now runs that helps victims of child abuse, the first thing that she says to someone when they come into her in the Ashling Centre is, I believe you before you open your mouth. I talked to a nun who worked in Golden Bridge at the same time as Christine. She told me that Sister Xavier, who was the manager of the school when Christine was there, said in her deathbed, should I have loved them more? Should I have hugged them more? She told me Christine Buckley told me that we are victims until we become survivors. How do you get to be a survivor? I asked her. Therapy, she said. I thought about that a lot. In therapy, you rake over the past in order to find the lessons for the present. I began to think of this show like a journey from victimhood to responsibility for Ireland. I felt responsible as an artist and a citizen to aid that process, to bring Ireland from victimhood to survival and responsibility. As a theatre maker, I could contribute in a very real way to the mood of what was happening out there, if only to the few hundred people who would get to see the show. I could offer them catharsis. I talked to people who lived here, hundreds of them. I took their witness statements. I tried to document their experience, from the man whose family lived in the land for generations, only to have his home demolished on a promise from Bernard McNamara and then be left with nothing. He told me there's not even a plaque to say that this is where Keogh Square was. To the lady who was the last person to live here, who moved all her furniture out of her tower block on Christmas Eve because she was the last person left and it wasn't safe anymore, who is still waiting for a house. Her son was 5 when she started to volunteer campaigning at regeneration meetings, and he's now 21. I was there. I got to know people. I made friends. I listened. I navigated a complex matrix of trust where I was constantly searching for my own version of the truth. We always worked on site. We held open rehearsals. We didn't work with anyone. This was not outreach. We all worked together, egalitarian. Actors would be improvising and getting notes from the people who lived there, and sure, why wouldn't they? We were in a surreal, new and complex space. How do you be careful with how you hand back the history when the people who lived there are sitting right beside you? And will you get a riot if you do that? How far is too far? I spent a long time wrestling with my conscience about the how of what I would represent of what happened here. I didn't want to just read the Ryan report out loud, just because I knew it was more complex than that. I wanted to present more than that. I didn't want it to be us versus them. I wanted to ask the childish questions. I wanted to say, why are people poor? I suppose, like all good artists, I learned that it would have to be about me. I love Ireland. I love Lauren Larkin. I think that what artists do is infuse the dialogue with imagination. My Ireland was Lauren Larkin. My Virgin Mary was Louise Lewis. Shane Byrne played our whole government. Barry O'Connor was the revolutionaries and Ger Kelly was all of you, the people watching. In the end, what happened didn't really matter. The facts, the figures, the stuff I stayed up all night over. What mattered was how we felt about what happened. That it was a wake and a baptism all at once. History is a hopeful journey from victimhood to responsibility. We talk a lot lately in the theatre about what it means to bear witness to our shameful and troubling past. I've sat in this room on many occasions in the last 5 or 6 years and watched the nation reenacted to moving effect. We talk a lot lately in the country about why we don't do anything about anything. Ireland is a place where you can say what you like, but you can't do what you like. A monologue is one version of the truth. If I was here on this stage performing a monologue, I would be pretending that you were someone else and that I was someone else, and I would be recounting for you a version of the truth. We knew that to do what we needed to do with history, we would have to show many different perspectives. We knew it was not enough to just bear witness. I think that what we did in the end was we explored the complexity of what happened here. We staged the complexity of our Irishness with all the shame and celebration. At the end of what we showed to our audience, they were invited to leave the space with us together and to walk to City Hall together. We asked them, will you walk with us? Every night I watched people agree to come with us. I watched them walk behind Lauren in her green velvet cape. I am very proud that what we showed activated people to do that, to say yes. I don't know exactly why they did it yet, but I am just at the start with this one. It's a rare and strange thing to sit in a room with strangers nowadays, and there's a power in that. Irish history is painful. I am glad that our version of history in some way pointed towards the future. We didn't set out to, and we didn't solve anything. We set out to give people access to the various ways of doing something, anything. We asked them to think about what they wanted. As an artist, it's my job to ask questions, and I think that I did that. I often feel a lot of pressure from the world outside my world to write the answers, but I just feel like that would be terrible art. But then again, maybe people would riot, and that must be what I want. People took to the streets, though, after the work I made. But did anyone really know we were there? Does anyone really know that we're here now? Will anyone really hear what I'm going to say next? I feel like there's further to go. I feel like I've got more to do. It doesn't stop here, it starts here. I still have so much more work to do on all of it, it's massive. And that's kind of why it's hard to stand up here when in many ways I don't feel like I've done it yet. But I know that I'm going to keep trying. The first part of the trilogy is the family, a close-up of the first society where it all went wrong and where it all went right. The second part, heroine, looks at what happens when we leave the home, and history is the third part. The next thing I want to do is I want to try and show all these over one day in 2014. I want to bring strangers into a room to witness the staging of the complexity of our story together. I don't know how I'm going to make that happen, and I don't know where I'll do it. We don't have anyone who can help us do it, and we don't have loads of money, but I just thought I'd mention that because you never know who's in the room. So if you're interested in our work, come and talk to me. I'll be around for the rest of the day. Thanks very much.
Now, our second speaker from the theatre arts is Eleanor Methven, and it would be an impertinence of me to introduce, in some respects, Eleanor, who has produced so many distinguished plays here on the Abbey stage. But I do want to say that she is a co-founder of the very influential Charabanc theatre company and a most distinguished actor and a producer and somebody who is a powerful force and presence in Irish theatre. So, ladies and gentlemen, Eleanor Methven.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I hardly recognise myself there. I'm sure Fake will be glad to hear that I produce on the Abbey stage, but there you go. Good afternoon. No, is it? Morning still, folks? You've no idea of the personal pleasure it gives me to listen to Grace. Considering where I came from, it validates a great deal to know that that work is still going on. It was wonderful, Grace. Thank you. My involvement in this was, of course, originally suggested because I spent some years, as Kevin said, as co-founder and co-artistic director of Charabanc Theatre Company, which grew out of Belfast. And while I was trawling the net and digging books out of my library on that subject as aid memoir, and memoir needs a bit of aiding now, been a lot of blood and wine under the bridge since then, Fake rang for a wee bit of a pep chat and said, sure, just talk about yourself, which I can only construe in the context of the title of today's panel, Making History, Artists in the Past, as a reference to my being an historical artefact. Thanks very much. And in the past few years, I've had the privilege of working with many younger theatre practitioners who've studied at, for instance, Trinity or UCD, and have been informed several times that I'm also a module. And if you'd told the Charabanc founders when we began sitting in Belfast kitchen houses in 1983, listening to 70 and 80-year-old former mill workers talk about their memories, that we would one day be a module in drama studies and women's studies programmes, well, I mean, that's what history does for you. So I stand before you today, a footnote. But to talk about Charabanc is to talk about myself. It only occupied 12 of my 36 years to date in this profession, but it was my crucible. Charabanc's work foregrounded the voices of working class women in the context of the highly patriarchal and conservative tautology, I know, cultural and political atmosphere of the 1980s North. We wanted to cast a new eye on the received wisdoms, and we needed to explore them for ourselves. We didn't perceive ourselves as anything other than indigenous to the tribes. We weren't preaching at them. We were looking for enlightenment, not bringing it. We were artists raised in, living in, and affected by the prevailing conditions. And we were met by the various communities whom we approached for help and information throughout the years with curiosity, generosity, kindness, humour, and a frank wonder that anyone felt them worth asking to, that their memories were of value. This was our own society, and our priority audience was our own society, taking the work back into those communities to receive their comment and to provoke discussion. But the interest in what we produced, this new female gaze in the North, from a wider world was gratifying in the extreme. Through the log jam of outside cultural and political commentators and foreign journalists desperate for a new angle on Belfast at the time, and if you threw a stone you'd hit one, which is perhaps an unfortunate analogy considering the time and place, through those curious outsiders coming in to watch, in the first instance, our inaugural production, Lay Up Your Ends, amongst the audiences of former mill workers in disused mills, or later watch our play Somewhere Over the Balcony, set in Dyas Flats, to watch it in Dyas Community Centre, alongside its residents and their local political representatives with attendant bodyguards. Oh, the frisson. Through our being Indigenous artists creating interest in something from within, we were invited to take the work out. These stories and voices of Belfast mill workers, of market traders, of RUC and IRA wives and mothers, and of the women under siege in Dyas Flats we brought firstly here to the Republic, then Britain, Canada, the USA, West Germany, and were the first Irish company ever to perform in the USSR. Do you see what artists can achieve? The last two of those countries no longer exist. We would dearly have loved to have literally taken all those women on that journey with us. Now, there's a documentary I'd like to see. But we were not a community theatre company. We were professional writers and interpretive artists who chose a particular working method and populist style which spoke to our concerns and spoke to our target audience. Experts in our field, like the Rubber Bandits today. Our plays examined, for example, 1911 through the eyes of York Street mill workers, whose strike brought about the first women's branch of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. The 1949 so-called Chapelgate elections and the demise of post-war anti-sectarian and organised labour politics in the North through the eyes of the self-employed entrepreneurial black beg women, traders in St George's Market. Female immigration from the signing of the Ulster Covenant in 1912 to the present-day 1980s. In other words, we were looking at where we come from in order to get us up to date, where we are now. In these plays, Catholic and Protestant, Unionist and Nationalist, Republican and Loyalist characters shared the stage. By the time 1987 came around and we produced Somewhere Over the Balcony, set in the Republican Dyas Flats complex, we had taken the decision to set it entirely amongst women from a Republican culture. We wanted to illustrate the extreme stretching of the parameters of what had come to pass as normal life in the North and the coping mechanisms it produced in women. And to do that, we had to set it in the most extreme, the most surreal place. There were large public housing projects of massive social deprivation in all cities of the Western world. There still are. At the height of Thatcherism in Belfast, the former inner-city working-class population, Protestant and Catholic, who had serviced Belfast's Victorian industrial might, had been cleared into purpose-built sectarian estates. The housing conditions in the Protestant Shankill Road flats, also in West Belfast, known because of their proclivity to hold on to damp as the Weetabix flats, were as bad as Dyas. But nowhere else in Ireland or Britain had a 24-hour British Army surveillance post on top of the tower block, looking down onto the low-rise maisonettes and conducting armed patrols several times a day along the connecting balconies, which were the only safe place for children to play. Dyas was the nadir. Dyas was the zenith. It was the place to where the roadmap of our previous work had led us. In order to get to that play, we had to journey by way of the others. Any examination of a community's culture, including Limerick, cannot be taken in isolation from its history, from what created it in the first place. Why Moy Ross? As artists being afforded the opportunity to take our work outwards, we had the enrichment of working in many international festivals, seeing other work from other cultures. As importantly, having the opportunity to talk to other international artists. I cannot imagine what wonderful creation would have been born had a puppet show, such as Royal Deluxe, been invited to Dyas to, for example, make something with the youngsters out of all the cars they stole, joy-rided on, goaded the British Army to chase them, and then drove into the complex to be set alight at their mother's insistence so that poor wee man can get his insurance. I can only imagine that a good few of those youngsters would have been inspired to continue getting their kicks less dangerously, more creatively, and with some pride demanding respect for their work and their community. Charabanc Theatre Company caused no feminist socialist revolution. It did not inspire truth and reconciliation to break out all over the 6 counties. It did, however, and has been cited as such, make a difference to the cultural landscape for artists who followed. It humanised the grim footage and lazy soundbite of the news coverage of a particular place at a particular time. We, as theatre artists, directed that gaze. We had the choice of product, and we took control over its means of production. Just as Druid Theatre Company, founded by theatre artists before us, and Rough Magic, founded by theatre artists slightly after, to take 2 prominent and successful examples, still do. Charabanc was a structure which I helped build, in which I could make sense of my choice of profession, a means of mitigating the guilt imposed upon me for that choice by the suspicious, ill-informed and fearful suppositions made by those in my cultural background about those who make that choice. That cultural background being Ulster non-conformist, to which, if you want to subscribe, you must conform. Theatre artists were viewed as escapist, inherently irresponsible, childish, and at their worst, subversive. Had a whiff of the louche and dissipated about them, sulphurous and flahoolach. Or, in Ulster Scots, of which, and I've done an online test, apparently I'm a native speaker. You can get a grant for me. Feckless and handless. The historical view of the artist, which apparently pertains and is still peddled in the most self-assured, smug and facile manner. You're on day 2 of this symposium, and I would imagine a certain amount of discussion has taken place of the Limerick exposure. So much has been said about this recently, and I welcome the lancing of the boil. However, I proceed with trepidation under the warning, and I quote, "There's not a blind bit of advantage to anybody in any more quotes appearing anywhere about what's happened," says Terry Prone, taking the opportunity to hide her light under the bushel of publication in the Irish Independent. She goes on. She goes on from the standpoint of the noble profession of PR consultant. The artistic sector in common, apparently, with the voluntary sector, is awash in big egos pretending to be small egos, full of competition and blistering enmity and righteous wrecking balls. I'll repeat that last word in case you didn't hear it. That was balls. Balls. In Charabanc, we learned to respect ourselves through respecting the privilege afforded us by our own community, who were gracious in their acceptance of and aid to us, and gaining respect for and interest in their voice, their culture, their memories on an international stage. This was far from a rebranding exercise. A brand imposes itself upon and cauterizes the skin, but it does not go deeper into the body politic. It has no meaningful long-term effect apart from stamping outside ownership, traditionally on slaves or cattle, and forming a scab which, by its very nature, will fall away eventually, leaving only its scar. Younger companies such as Anu, Wilfred and Theatre Club, amongst many, continue to examine where we've been and are now. Artists make history, as do all the other active and contributory citizens. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that module, Eleanor. Our third in this trilogy of distinguished theatre practitioners is Bairbre Keeve. Again, needs no introduction to anybody who is in any way familiar with Irish theatre, or indeed stage, screen, radio and television. Multiple award-winning artist and artistic director of Calypso, associate artist here at the Abbey Theatre, directing credits, and of course a huge repertoire of very distinguished work on the stage, including this one here. So my very great pleasure to introduce Bairbre Keeve.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I'd like to apologise to all of you who are expecting Emer O'Kelly. I'm sure I'm a big disappointment, but I'll do my best. And I believe, for those of you who didn't realise I'm not Emer O'Kelly, there is a little slip in that beautifully produced book with my name and CV on it. And I think the last time I was on a little slip in an Abbey programme was during the World Cup in 1990, when I went on for Breeding Yachten in the Charabanc, Gary Hines' Charabanc, because sadly her dad passed away. So I'm a slip again. So anyway, I didn't have a huge amount to prepare for this, but this is what I've come up with. First of all, over the past years, when I was working, say, as artistic director of Calypso, there were works which, as Kevin said, would have been about looking at how the past bleeds into the present. And one of those, which I remember very, very warmly, was Donal O'Kelly's Operation Easter, which we put on in Kilmainham Jail. And what was kind of, I suppose, different about that was that we tried to start it in present-day Ireland. That was 1996, so it was the 90th anniversary of the Easter Rising. And if we decided to start it quite deliberately in Moore Street, because that is, of course, where the leaders actually, what's the word? Surrendered, that's the word. And anyway, but in 1996, of course, Moore Street was such a different street. And it was, you know, full of people from new communities. And we reflected that in our cast as well, because we had a Nigerian and a Kosovar actor in our production, both of whom were living in Dublin at the time and are still living in Dublin. So that was Operation Easter. That was very exciting for me, trying to look at 1916 through the lens of 1996 and of a changed country. Another production that I was involved in for Storytellers Theatre Company was called When the Wall Came Down, because I'm not just interested in Irish history, I'm interested in European, in world history. So I worked there with a writer called Renata Ahrens-Kramer, who lives most of the year in Ireland. And she wanted to write a story about what happened in Berlin after the wall came down. And it was a story about forced adoptions in Germany, in East Germany, and what happened when the wall came down, when people suddenly discovered that actually my parents aren't my parents. And it was about a woman who had been deported to the West Germany, coming back to try and find her child, and informing this child for the first time at the age of 18 that actually your mother is not your mother. So it was an incredibly emotional journey, the whole thing, but also we used footage from after the war, because Renata's mother had herself been in Berlin after the war, and we used actual footage of the rebuilding of Berlin, very often by the women. So it was kind of fascinating, that whole thing, and we brought the show to Berlin, which was amazing, and the show was translated, which is kind of odd, but it was translated from English into German as a result of our visit. So that was kind of exciting. The third play I would remember by a playwright I just have such huge respect for was Master Harold and the Boys, which of course is set during apartheid, and it's a coming-of-age piece about a young boy called Hallie who has two role models, his white, bigoted South African father and a black servant that works in their coffee shop called Sam, who is who is actually his mentor. Again, that was a real learning experience for all of us. I found out so much about South Africa. I went to South Africa in the course of the research for it, and I found it an extraordinary experience. And there's an amazing speech in it, because I'm sure an awful lot of you know the play, but just in case you don't, one of the big metaphors in the play is ballroom dancing. And you have these two black South African men ballroom dancing with each other. And Sam gives this wonderful speech about the world, that the problem with the world is if only they could learn how to ballroom dance, you could move around together. Russia and America could move around together without bumping into each other. So it's just fantastic. If you don't know it, I would advise you to read it or just whatever. Anyway, what I really want to talk to you about today is the companies I've mentioned. Calypso no longer exists. Storytellers no longer exist. Like a lot of the small companies, they're now gone. So what does an artist do in this day and age if you have an idea, if there's something you want to interrogate from the past that has a big impact on our present and on our future? What do you do? Well, I can only speak for myself, and I can tell you what I did. You've heard from two artists here about how they went about it. There is a project that's burning me up and has been for over a year now, probably longer, and that is to do with World War I. And it is to find a place in our history for those Irish men and Irish women who took part in that World War, and to do that as an artist. I've been reading, I suppose, like everybody else, I cried my way through Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy. I loved Sebastian Barry's A Long, Long Way. I've just made my way through Beauty and the Sorrow by Peter Englund, which is just extraordinary. It's like it takes 20 people from different parts of the world. I mean, you forget that the First World War was fought in Africa as well. You know what I mean? It's extraordinary. And all these people who kept memoirs from different countries, from completely different backgrounds, and it just goes through the war week by week, year by year, and you get an insight into these people. So I also read Pat McGinley, the wonderful Pat McGinley, whose writing is extraordinary, from Glentees in County Donegal. And I discovered a man called Edward Rowe. If anybody's interested in the First World War, he's written a book called Diary of an Old Contemptible. He was a man from Westmeath who joined the British Army in 1905, went off to India and South Africa, came back, tried to settle down, couldn't kind of hack it with people talking about seed potatoes and chickens and the price of Hereford cows, and decided to re-enlist in 1914, went right through the war, all the way from Mons to Baghdad. And he writes so brilliantly. And this is a young man who would never gone beyond primary school, of course. But it's extraordinary, and it's kept in Preston Museum, Military Museum. I had to go there to see the original. Anyway, all that is by way of research. You can tell I love research, and I'm completely immersed in it. But I came across a story at home here in Dublin of a woman called Monica Roberts from Stillorgan. And when war broke out in 1914, she wanted to do her bit. She wasn't going to be a nurse or a VAD, and indeed lots of Irish women did that, but she wasn't cut out for that. So what she decided to do was form the Band of Helpers to the Soldiers, which is a lovely kind of old-fashioned name. And she decided that she would write to as many soldiers, just the ordinary men. She wanted to write mainly to privates and sergeants, to the non-commissioned people as opposed to officers. So she decided she would write to the Dublin Fusiliers and also to some people in the Royal Flying Corps. So what I've done is I've read over 200 of the letters she wrote, and she sent, oh my goodness, at least she received, not the letters she wrote, the letters that she received, and also the postcards she received from World War I. So what you have is quite extraordinary. It is the letters, not that historians, it's not a book about what happened, it's people writing and saying, oh, we're very busy at the moment, and you look at the date and you go, oh, that was the Somme. Or there's somebody writing on saying, I've just come back from Dublin, in May, and saying the city was in ruins. I couldn't come out to visit you in Stillorgan. Like, just amazing stuff. But they're writing from the thick of the action. They're writing from the trenches. They're writing from billets. They're not writing great prose. They're not going to, they're not the people you'll have, their memoirs will be published, but they're people whose voices have been silenced or just have never been heard. And I find it incredibly exciting. So what I'm hoping to do is to take those letters as a basis for a show and give a voice to those people who joined the British Army because whatever reasons, they were living in tenements, they'd no jobs, who joined because for ideological reasons, because people did believe in ideologies then. People did believe in God. They were incredibly religious, a lot of them. They believed in their country. They believed in the rights of small nations. It's like they joined for so many different reasons. Some people, of course, just joined because they needed to economically. There's extraordinary stories. There's two of the writers are from North King Street, which is around the corner from where I live. And one of them was writing home from the front asking Monica if she could find out what had happened after Lindenhall Street Barracks had been burnt down by the rebels during Easter week, because he was worried about his family. So you're out at the front, you're fighting in a British uniform, and you're afraid that there'd be reprisals from the British Army on your family in North King Street, which of course there were reprisals. 13 people were killed. So there's all those kind of complexities. It's not straightforward. I grew up knowing all about 1916, knowing all about the rebellion. I was in love with Sean McDermott there because I thought he was the best looking of them. I mean, I've seen more pictures of Patrick Pearse in profile, I suppose, than I've seen of anybody else in my life. And that's what I grew up, and I really respect those. I really respect the leaders from 1916, but I never knew. Nobody told me about the 200,000 plus Irishmen and women who voluntarily went out to fight because they believed in something. And nobody told me what happened to them. Nobody told me about the people who died. Nobody told me about the people who came back shell-shocked, or who came back without limbs or without half their faces. I just didn't know about that. And yet I love history. I loved history at school. I did it right up to my Leaving Cert. But I never heard the inside story of those people. And their stories deserve to be told. So that is my ambition. I want those stories to be told. I also want it to be told very much because I'm an artist, because how did Monica afford to constantly send cigarettes, razors, soap, socks, mufflers? How did she afford to do that? First of all, she set up this little band and people had to pay threepence to join, and then they would pay a little amount if they could every month. Or else they would send her things that could be sent out. She would tell them what to send out. But the second thing she did was they put on concerts. They sang songs. They played the piano, they played the violin. There were elocutionists who would recite poems. And of course, meanwhile, out at the front, there were concert parties doing the very same. So that's the other thing that fires my imagination. I want to use the music. I want to use the actual music that they would have used and just sort of see how that worked. I mean, there's a fantastic song, I'm sure some of you know it, from Oh, What a Lovely War. And I'm sure you think I'm just going to burst into song now, but I'm not. But it's kind of fantastic because it was a recruiting song. We don't want to lose you, but we think you ought to go. I mean, no pressure there, you know? So there's just amazing music. Just to give you a sample of one person, there was a man called Edward Mordaunt. He was born in Upper Rutland Street in a tenement. At the age of 15, he was living in a boys' home on Abbey Street, and he was a street trader selling matches. He enlisted at the age of 16 in 1911, went off to India and France, came back in September 14, had a toe removed, went out to the front, went all through the war, and he had this fantastic thing at the end of all his letters and cards. He wrote her 37 letters, and at the end of every letter he goes, "But are we downhearted? No. Are we going to win? Yes." And I never knew. I thought, this is fantastic. This is his motto, or this is the Fusiliers' motto. There's 2 songs with that in the chorus, and they're kind of fantastic songs. He talked about the rats, he talked about the lice that would eat you while you were alive, and the rats that would eat you if you were dead. He talked about taking the bodies, trying to get the bodies into the trenches because the rats would eat them otherwise. He's just extraordinary. He wrote and asked her for gloves because he was going on a bomb throwing course, and that would be very handy. And you can see it in the Irish Times. Monica's there and she's asking people for old gloves if they'd send them to her. They played snakes and ladders. They played cards. He writes and he asks her for house. Do you know what house is? Bingo. To send out bingo cards. Like, it's just such an insight to their ordinary lives and deaths in the trenches. And of course, you're reading somebody's letters and then suddenly they disappear, and you look up the records and you find out died on the 1st of July, 1916. So what happened? The first day of the Somme. You know, so you kind of, because they're not allowed to say where they are, so you get somewhere in France is written at the top of the letter. Or trenches, or the front, or billets. But these letters, they're just something we deserve access to. It's part of our history, and I have every intention of finding a way to do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bairbre, and indeed to Eleanor and Grace as well. I'm going to take the chairman's prerogative and ask the first question, which is a slightly naughty one. Back to your joyriders, Eleanor. The statistics now will show that there's way less joyriding, and the answer, why? Because they're all on Grand Theft Auto 5 or 565 or whatever it is. You know, so like their imaginations are more engaged now by doing the damn thing on a digital screen than they are driving around in Tala or Jobestown or Divis Flats or whatever. But so my question would be, in this 21st century world, which is increasingly digital, where you have film, which has so many resources, and one thing I think that all three of you touched on is just how difficult it is to make theatre, and then, particularly in the current day, how difficult it is to get funding for it, get it made. But my question would be, you know, how vibrant would you feel the future of theatre is as a way of kind of addressing this, as against this enormous pull of, and the enormous resources that are in the kind of digital space and the film space? Would you be in any way worried about the future of theatre as a way of making history? And I'll address that first to you, Eleanor. You have a microphone. Oh. Yeah.
The luxury of... Oh, is it on? Yeah. 1, 2, yeah. The luxury of using a mic on the stage. Well, I know you were lighthearted, but the reason there isn't as much joyriding anymore is because the streets aren't full of British Army to chase them, you know. That's the thing, it's about excitement, isn't it? I mean, joyriding was about excitement. What could be more exciting than having armed British soldiers and a Saracen chasing you all around your neighbourhood and into the flats? Grand Theft Auto, those digital games, I suppose it's about a vicarious excitement. If theatre is to make any difference, then it must excite and it must engage. And I absolutely recognise your question. I love going to the movies. I can walk out of a bad movie. It's much harder to walk out of a bad piece of theatre, to be honest with you. But it is interesting, actually, because a film that doesn't engage me won't irritate me as much as a piece of theatre that doesn't. That's an interesting thing. I get less patient with that. I mean, I'm not talking about any theatre in particular, but genuinely, I think that's at the crux of that. Because theatre, when it engages and when it does well, it's live. It's also a communal thing, as Grace was saying. You know, people are more isolated. We don't sit together when you receive a film, but somehow an audience is required to participate in theatre. It's always fascinated me, and I'm sure it has the other two, every night, the psychology of an audience. Why is it slightly different? We're slightly different. It's a live art form. It is a communal witnessing and experience. And I can certainly take it back to the Charabanc plays, for instance, where we would be playing in the sectarian areas. You might be playing in a UDA drinking club, and on stage you'd have a character giving the Sinn Féin line. That's electric. And that was a safe place for people to go to hear that. And there was nowhere else they were going to hear that. They were going to hear politics mouthed, but not someone who in the first act, you know, the woman sitting in the audience had grew to love because she had the same problems as them, husband on the dole, the kids, all the rest of it, social deprivation. And once you wooed them into saying, yeah, she's me, she's absolutely me, she came at you with an entirely different point of view. That's electric. Now, that's that particular kind of theatre, I know, but that's what theatre does. It poses dilemmas. What if? It's a thing of the imagination. So I think any nation is only going to have its compassion intact if it keeps its imagination intact. And I do think that live art forms service that very well. Now, shut up now, somebody else should talk.
No, that's a very, I'm going to pass to Grace.
It's the same question.
Yeah.
I suppose for me, it's a kind of question that comes up quite a bit, and for me, I just don't feel like there's any competition, I suppose. And I think the reason for that is kind of what Eleanor was talking about there, like that it's the last place where that liveness is possible in our society. Theatre is the last place where strangers can sit in a room together and be provoked to actually talk to the person sitting next to them. And that's the magic of it, and that's why I do it, even though it's incredibly stupid to do it in loads of ways. But I do it because there's nothing more brilliant than watching watching two people who don't know each other come into a space together, and then by the interval, recently when we performed Heroine in The Mermaid in Bray, there was a woman who was crying on the shoulder of another woman who, and they spoke in the post-show discussion that they'd never met each other before, and that just can't happen anywhere else. And I think it's because the people, what's the difference between that and the cinema? I suppose it's that the people sitting here are real and they're really talking to you. And like in my talk when I asked, and we've all read the proclamation, haven't we? You can all say yes straight away. Whereas in film or on television or something like that, you don't have that immediate form for conversation between the people on the stage or the artists and the audience. And I think that's why it has the capability to actually inspire real change. And that's kind of why I'm not worried about it.
We'll get Bairbre on as well. Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
I would agree that it's not a competition. I think they can actually enhance each other. And I think, just to give you a very practical example, apart from these letters that have been archived, I've seen the personal collection of the daughter of the woman who received all those letters, the ones that weren't eaten by mice. But, for example, in a presentation, in a production, you could have actors, you have live voices, you have a three-dimensional sort of representation of those letters, but you could enhance it. You could enhance it by having the actual postcard, the actual writing reproduced, projected. You can even now get these things called bullet cameras, and you can attach them, they're like little torches. I shouldn't be telling you the tricks, but you can attach it to a pen, and you can actually see what somebody is writing. So you could have somebody writing and somebody could see it, which also, of course, is very good for perhaps somebody who has hearing difficulties. It's not just always about sign languages. All those things help. So I would say that's it. And certainly, as you would say in your work and Anne's work, technology is just part and parcel of it. You don't even question it. It's just there. But when it's in conjunction with the live performer, I think that's when it really is very exciting.
Okay, we're running a little bit strapped on the time, so I do believe there's a roving mic, and I'm going to allow some questions from the audience. And I'll start with this gentleman here. If you have a good loud voice, fire ahead.
Thank you, and thanks to the panellists for incredibly erudite and insightful contributions. What really came through for me was just the sense of an ethical bind between the artists and the stories and the place and the people they work with. And I was just wondering, do any of the panel or have any of the panel at any point in time ever felt that they were artistically or imaginatively perhaps compromised or bound by the stories and the places and the memories of those places and stories? Were their visions somewhat perhaps compromised ever?
Do you want to start there on that?
Yeah. I think, I have my own.
Sorry, Grace.
I asked for my own.
Younger generation. Technology's your thing.
She's closest to me physically.
I suppose, yeah, that's a constant kind of struggle, and it's something that I suppose informs the work in loads of ways as well. Like when you say, have I ever had that experience? It's like, have you ever breathed? Like, do you know what I mean? That's kind of, it's the day-to-day kind of, those are the hazards of doing what I do. And I suppose it comes down to kind of what I was saying, you always have these kind of battles, and I suppose with history, because it was a public art commission, so they asked us to come in, like the community had commissioned us, and the community were our bosses in loads of ways. So it was like, you had to be very careful how you hand people back their history in loads of ways. So that was hard on that kind of level. And then the responsibility that you feel then as well in terms of the story and the narrative of that story, because you're in a position, and I think I put myself in that position where I was creating my own narrative out of real life events that really happened to real people. So when I'm making, a moment in the show about the last tower block crumbling down, I have to remember all the time that somebody stood there and watched their wallpaper be kind of eaten away by a massive digger, and their whole lives had been in that tower block. But I don't want to talk just about their whole lives. I want to talk about the whole country and the whole nation. So there's the balance all the time between those things. And then I think what it always comes down to is, like, it has to come back to me, because that's just how it has to come back to. I think that's just part and parcel of the art making process. You have to go back to, what do I think about this and what do I feel about this? And then it's about trust. And you go, well, people trust me to do it. So that's kind of where you kind of come down to. But the battle is constant around it, and it is totally present in the work.
Trust is absolutely the thing. I mean, I do remember in one of our plays, which was dealing with contemporary politics in Northern Ireland, those of us who had actually done the research, talking to people and so on, there was a certain amount of pressure sometimes from outside to come to a certain conclusion, to put words into the mouths of the ordinary characters that we were talking to, which would sway it politically one way or the other. And you simply had to say no. I mean, if you wish to do agitprop, it's actually easier. It's so much easier because then you know what you're, what it is you want to say. Our project was slightly different in that we wanted to give voice to voices which hadn't been heard before. I mean, obviously it's editorialized. Of course it is. That would be naive to say it wasn't. But sometimes, yes, we had pressure from other people who would come into the company to help us realize a vision. And we did have a certain amount of pressure occasionally from the people who funded, if the material wasn't very popular. But you know, you keep going and say, no, this is what we're going to say. Yeah, I don't know, whatever. Yes, go on. Sorry, not very articulate about that. Sorry.
I don't think anything of the work I've directed has been compromised, except economically at times, if you know what I mean. But just one story that is kind of interest, it's sort of relevant to what you're saying. I remember acting in a news laundry, and it was just a little scene in the church where people came in and had to hold my hand, and the first line I had to say to them, it was a verbatim piece, I had to say, oh, when he was dying, my husband, you know, he asked me to make a promise to him, words to that effect. And this woman just burst into tears, and she said, my daughter died last Christmas. And that was the end of the monologue, because like she just needed comfort, so you just improvised. So I just let her talk and I let her cry, and I brought her on to the next stage and explained to the next actor that she was very upset and she was looked after there, and she had a different journey through the laundry, but that was fine too, if you know what I mean. It didn't matter that she missed that bit of the story because something else was going on there. Normally, I suppose in a traditional theatre, if somebody has that kind of catharsis or whatever, it happens privately and the lights are off in the dark, but that happened with the lights up, and I'd never come across that situation, so that's the only thing I can say.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to truncate the discussion because we're under the time constraint that always comes into these wonderful sessions. I have a good friend, Hank Hennessy, up in, he's a glazier up in Kimmage, and he said to me one time when I ran over, particularly in morning sessions, he says it's very dangerous to get between hungry people and their lunch. So I don't want to be in that situation. But I do want to say that we have been joined this morning by very distinguished theatre practitioners in this city of Dublin. And one of the things that I love living in Dublin, why I love living in Dublin, one of the key things for me is that this is a city which has so much theatre, so many theatre companies, and so much energy and so much talent involved in it. And we are lucky to live in a country which has produced Charabanc, which has produced Calypso, which has produced Field Day, which has produced Druid, which has produced Rough Magic, which has the Abbey Theatre here as a national theatre. You know, we're very lucky to have that quality of theatre and that quality of theatre practitioners right across the board in this city. It is a city which is still a very, very vibrant space if you look at it globally. There are many cities which have no theatre. We have tons of them, and we have fantastically talented people, and we're very lucky in that sense. And I also kind of want to ask you to join with me in thanking our panellists this morning, because these are people who sometimes, as I say, give other people's words voice and body and movement, but this morning they have to speak, as it were, in propria persona, and I think you'll agree with me that they did that wonderfully. So please join me in thanking Grace, Eleanor and Bairbre.